Hey everyone, welcome back to Tip of the Week. For this week's video, I want to give you guys some tips and tricks on how to edit night photography. I'm going to show you how I took this Milky Way photo here and really made it come to life using only a few adjustments and filters that I've learned to love inside of ON1 Photo RAW 2018. So to get started here, we're actually just going to begin inside of the Browse module, and this is where I'm basically just going to find the photo that I want to edit. So I know that I shot some vertical shots of this Milky Way, but the one I want to edit is actually a landscape. So I'll just navigate down to my landscape shots. I'll select this one because I think it's the one I want. And yeah, so this is the one I want to edit. I'll head into Develop here. So now that we're inside of Develop, this is where I'm going to set the basic tonality and the color point for my photo. But the first thing I want to do is I just want to crop my shot. And the reason I want to crop it is because I was shooting with a pretty wide angle lens. Whenever I'm shooting Milky Ways or trying to shoot any sort of astrophotography, I generally like to have a pretty wide angle lens. And this was shot with a 17 to 40 millimeter at 17 millimeters. So you'll notice that there's a sort of a bunch of dead space around my Milky Way and my mountain. So I'll just head over to the crop tool here. I'll hold down the shift key to make sure the proportions are right. And I'll just drag it down and I'll sort of pull this crop over to where it lines up with the Milky Way right here, and then I have my mountain sort of near this other point, and I can just hit enter, and now I have a nice cropped frame for my Milky Way shot. So now that we have a nice crop for our photo, the next thing I like to do is I like to set the basic tonality for my shot. And there's a couple of different ways I like to do that, sort of just depending on what I'm shooting. Generally, if I'm shooting a photo like this, if I'm photographing the Milky Way, I'll like to do it inside of the tone and color pane inside of Develop. So I'm going to show you how I do that real quick, and then later on in the video I'll show you the second way I like to set the tonality for my night shots. So for the first example, the three controls that I generally use whenever I'm editing night photography are my exposure slider, my contrast slider, and my midtone slider. So to begin with, you're going to want to deal with the exposure in your image first. Generally, it's going to be a darker photo because you're shooting at night, and also you're going to have a little bit of noise in your photo because you're shooting at a higher ISO, I presume. So if you are shooting at a higher ISO, you're going to have a little bit of noise in the areas that are dark on your photo. So try not to expose too much, because if you pull up on it too much, you're going to blow out the sky, and then you're going to have a bunch of noise down where the shadowy areas meet your shot. So I would just leave it at maybe just a small bump. I would maybe even just bump it like 1 or 2 stops, because the main areas that you want to play with in these photos are your highlights and the whites and sort of the mid-tone areas. The exposure is going to brighten up the entire shot, and we don't really want that. So now that you have a nice little bump in your exposure, the second thing I would do is I would just pull up on the contrast. And the contrast is just going to bring back some of those darker areas in this photo and sort of make this Milky Way come to life. And now that you have your exposure set and you've added a little bit of contrast into your shot, the next thing I would do is just head over to your midtone slider and just sort of boost that up a little bit, and it'll bring back some of the light within the Milky Way and in the sky without brightening up these darker areas on the bottom. So now let's hit the backslash key on our keyboard. And you'll see that in just a few sliders, we've really set a nice tonality for our shot, and now we can take it into effects if we want to add some creative filters. But there's another way that you can set tonality pretty easily by just using effects. So I'm actually just going to head up to this tone and color, and I'm going to reset it so that I have basically no other adjustments on my photo other than a crop. And I'll just head into effects, and I'm going to add a filter, and I'm going to add tone enhancer. And one of my favorite things to use whenever I'm editing night photography is I generally like to use the tone curve, because it allows me to play with my highlights and my shadows a lot more and gives me a little bit more control of the overall tones in my shot. So I'm just going to open up the curves pane here. And if you're confused on how to use the tone curve, or you've never used it before, I made a video recently on how to use it. I'll include the link in that description. So if you are looking to learn a little bit more about the tone curve, head over to that video and give it a watch, and it should give you a little more clarity on how to use it. So what I generally like to do instead of the tone curve if I'm dealing with astrophotography is I'll pull up on the midtones by grabbing this point here and just pulling up on my midtones quite a bit. And then I'll head down to my shadow areas on my tone curve. I'll grab a point and I'll just pull down a little bit. And you'll see that it's already boosting those midtones to bring out the light inside of the Milky Way, but then I'm pulling back on the shadows to bring in some contrast to make the Milky Way pop. So if I go up here to this on and off button and turn it on and off, you'll see that we really made our photo come to life by simply using 2 points on a tone curve. So the tone curve is a really useful tool, especially when you're editing night photography, and it really allows you to control the overall tone of your image. So those are a couple different ways that you can set the basic tonality for your night shot. Now let me show you a couple ways that you can get creative with the filters. The first filter I like to use whenever I'm editing night photography is generally all the time going to be sunshine. Sunshine is the perfect filter for night photography because what sunshine does is it brightens the bright areas in your photo. In this case, it brightens up the brighter areas in our Milky Way, and it darkens the darker areas in my photo so that it brings a nice contrast and really makes this Milky Way come to life. So if I turn this on and off, you'll see it's doing a good job of bringing back some of those highlights in this Milky Way and then darkening the other areas in my photo. And the next filter I would recommend to use on top of your astrophotography or your night photos is I would go up to Add Filter and I would add Dynamic Contrast. And you'll see that if I turn this on and off, it's making the whole photo look a little crunchy and a little too crispy for my liking. So what I'll do is I'll head down to the medium and the large sliders here and I'll just reset them to 0. Now I have my dynamic contrast completely reset. And the only areas I really want to focus on are these areas of stars in my Milky Way. And those are going to be the small areas of micro contrast on my photo. So I'm just going to pull up on the small slider here. And you'll notice that it's applying it to the entire shot. So I'm going to head to my masking options. I'm going to invert the mask. And now my masking brush is selected. I'm going to make sure it's set to paint in. And now I'm just going to paint in that dynamic contrast onto my Milky Way here. And it's a little too crunchy for my liking, and the great thing about having filters instead of effects is you can play with the opacity. So I'll just head over to the opacity slider here, sort of move it around until I get to a spot that I like. Now if I turn it on and off, see that it really brought some detail into the Milky Way area. And the last creative filter I like to apply to my night shots is I'll head up to Add Filter and I'll add Split Tone. And the reason I like to add split toning is because it allows you to add a unique color tone to your photo. Especially if you're dealing with a bunch of shadows and a bunch of highlights, this allows you to easily modify those colors and tones by simply using a preset style here. I generally just head over to Warm. It'll remove some of that blue color cast that was already on my photo. And if I turn this on and off, it brought a little bit more color, added a unique style, and sort of took it from good to great. So if we take a look at our original shot here, you'll see that all of the filters and effects we added really added a unique style onto the Milky Way photo. So those are some tips and tricks that I like to use whenever I'm editing night photography. Thanks so much for watching Tip of the Week, and stay tuned for more.